Hi there, my name is Dr. Dorothy Buckley, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this video. So thus far, we have talked about a couple of really effective strategies for getting information into your memory, right? So we've talked about the benefits of retrieval practice or testing yourself for creating really robust memories that are less likely to be forgotten. So we've talked about retrieval practice. We've also talked about how to appropriately schedule your study time so that you're spacing out your study sessions or distributing them in time rather than cramming them all together. So what I'm going to talk about in this video is some other factors that will aid in encoding or make it easier for you to form memories that are robust and resistant to forgetting. So first we'll talk about the power of forming visual images. We'll talk about something called deep processing or active processing. We'll talk about making information self-relevant. And we'll talk about organizing to be remembered information. So first, let's start with the power of visual imagery in terms of how well it aids memory. So in this really famous experiment by Gordon and Wysans in 1970, there were basically two groups of participants. One group of participants was in the verbal rehearsal or repetition group. And so when these participants were given the word pair boat tree, they simply had to say the pair to themselves over and over again or engage in the same kind of rehearsal process that we've talked about with working memory. And then in the other group of participants, they had to generate a visual image that associated the two words boat and tree, right? So the kind of the obvious picture that you would generate is maybe a sailboat or a toy boat stuck in a tree, right? And what Gordon and Wysans found is that the group that created a visual image that associated the two words together recalled significantly more items at test than the group that rehearsed them. So this demonstrates the power of visual imagery in terms of supporting later retrieval. And so basically the explanation that we have for this is that when you create a visual image that associates two words together, you're essentially granting yourself at least two pathways with which you can retrieve the information. One pathway is verbal, right? So one pathway is using the words themselves, right? So that's kind of a verbal or auditory pathway. But you're also creating, along with that, a visual pathway. And 30% of the brain is actually devoted to visual processing. So not only are you taking advantage of the fact that your brain has all of this cortical space devoted to imaging, right? But you're also creating, like I said, a second pathway with which to recall the information. Another way that you can facilitate the encoding of information is to capitalize on what's called the levels of processing effect. So in 1975, two very prominent memory researchers by the name of Craik and Tolving came up with an interesting memory task. So if you were a participant in Craik and Tolving's levels of processing experiment, you would learn a series of words And most of those words were just very simple 4 to 7 letter concrete nouns like boat or house, things like that. But prior to being presented with the word, participants were asked a question about each word. And there were 3 types of questions participants could be asked. In one case, prior to seeing the word boat, for example, they would be asked, is this word presented in capital letters? Right? So if the word boat was presented in all caps, you would say no. And if it was presented in lowercase letters, if it was presented in all caps, you would say yes. And if it was presented in lowercase letters, you would say no. In another case, they would be asked a rhyming question. So, for example, does this word rhyme with bread? And if on the subsequent, a moment later, they saw the word boat, they would say no. Whereas if they saw the word red, they would say yes. And lastly, we have what was called a fill-in-the-blank task. So basically, you would be given a sentence with one word missing. So for example, the blank sailed on the ocean. Does that sentence make sense or not? And then if the word subsequently presented was boat, you would say, yes, that makes sense. Or if it was bread, you would say, no, that doesn't make sense, right? So prior to seeing each concrete noun, participants were asked one of 3 questions. So if you think about the type of information that participants in this experiment had to know, right? So we have a very, very simple task, such as is the letter presented in, or is the word printed in capital letters, right? All you would have to know in that instance is the physical characteristics of the letters. Are they big or small? And then for the rhyming question, you would have to know the phonetic properties of the word. What does the word sound like? And then lastly, for the fill in the blank question, in order to know that a sentence, the boat sailed on the ocean, makes sense, right? You would have to know the meaning of the word, right? So each of these 3 types of questions differed in the level of processing that the participant had to do, or the kind of the degree of thinking that the participant had to do prior to encoding the item. And the more deeply they processed the item, the more successful they were at recalling the item. So deep processing is really, or active processing as it's sometimes called, is really whenever you think about the meaning of the word, right? So thinking, what does this word mean, is deep processing. So relative to thinking about the physical characteristics of the word, or thinking about the sound-based properties of the word, thinking about the meaning of the word led to the highest rates of subsequent recall. So what does that reveal about the nature of long-term memory? Well, it suggests that unlike short-term memory or working memory, where information is stored according to sound-based properties, right? We see that with the phonological similarity effect, for example. Information in long-term memory is stored based on semantic relationships or based on meaning, right? So any question or any manipulation that taps into the meaning of a word is going to invoke deep processing. So the levels of processing effect is simply the finding that words that are processed for meaning as opposed to physical characteristics or sound-based properties are going to be recalled better. And related to that, we also have something called the self-reference effect. So this was first demonstrated by Rogers and colleagues in 1979. And so basically, in this experiment, for 3 of the conditions, they just repeated Craig and Tulving's 1975 levels of processing experiment. So sometimes participants were asked, what size of letters is this word printed in? Sometimes they were asked, does this word rhyme with boat? Sometimes they were asked a fill-in-the-blank sentence. Does this sentence make sense? Yes or no, right? The blank cross the road, okay? If the word was square, okay, that wouldn't make sense. Whereas if it was chicken, it would make sense, right? So we have 3 of the questions participants were asked were either physical characteristics, phonological or sound-based characteristics, or meaning-based characteristics. So we have shallow processing questions compared to deep processing questions. But Rogers and colleagues added a 4th type of question, and that was what they called self-reference processing or self-referential processing. And so for this question, they would be given an adjective, right? So an adjective like shy or quiet or ambitious, right? And they would be asked, does this adjective describe you? Yes or no, right? And so what Rogers and colleagues found is just like Craig and Tulving found, right? The questions about physical characteristics and sound-based characteristics led to significantly less successful recall or successful remembering compared to the deep processing question where you had to do the fill in the blank, right? Where you think about the definition of the word. But even more surprisingly, the self-reference question, does this adjective describe you, led to significantly better recall, even when compared to the deep processing or meaning-based question. So why is that? Well, it seems that the reason why deep processing is better is because not only are you thinking about the meaning of the word, but with both deep processing and self-referential processing, you're associating this new information that you're trying to learn with something that currently resides in your long-term memory. So when you're filling in a blank of a sentence and you're trying to decide, does the sentence, the boat crossed the road, make sense or not make sense, right? You're reaching into your long-term memory to access a definition of the word boat, right? But if I were to ask you, does the word shy describe you, yes or no, you're also attempting to reach into your long-term memory and recall instances where you've been shy, right? So any processing or any question that requires you to associate new information that you're trying to learn with information that's already successfully been encoded into your long-term memory, okay, is going to be associated with better memory. So both deep processing and self-reference processing are effective Because they help you associate new information with what's already in your long-term memory. So related to that, another experiment had two conditions. So in one condition, they would see adjectives, right? Like shy, ambitious, quiet, rude, right? And they would be asked, does this adjective describe you? In another condition, they were asked, does this adjective describe most people? Right? So are most people shy, quiet, ambitious, rude? And what they found is people's subsequent recall or memory for the adjectives was better when they processed them in terms of themselves as opposed to thinking about whether they are reflective of most people. Right? So it seems, again, that thinking about the self or self-referential processing is better for memory encoding or getting stuff into your long-term memory, right? Because when it comes to ourselves, we already have a robust network of memories. So once we activate those self-referential memories, it's much easier to encode new information. How else can we facilitate the encoding of new memories besides using deep as opposed to shallow processing and referencing ourself as opposed to others when trying to remember information? Well, one really effective strategy is to use some kind of an organizational structure, right? So one of the reasons that the ancient Greeks were so successful at creating this massive oral tradition, right, whereby philosophers and political leaders and such in ancient Greece could commit all of this vast amount of information to memory, is because they utilized storytelling, right? So storytelling is really nothing more than an organizational tool, right? So telling someone what you did today or about an experience that you've had is a way of organizing information in long-term memory. So how do we know that organizational structures can be helpful? Well, Gordon Bower and colleagues conducted a very simple experiment in the 1960s where they had two studying conditions. In one experiment, participants were given this beautiful organizational tree, like the one you see here. So they were given a tree that organized minerals by stones and diamonds, right? Or stones and metals, excuse me, right? So they had stones organized into precious versus masonry, and then they organized rare, common, and then alloys, right? So people were tested on their ability to recall all of these different minerals, right? And they compared a case where they were given this very effective graphic organizer, right, that highlighted the hierarchical relationship between all of these different minerals. And then in another condition where they were just given the list of minerals without any kind of organizational structure. And they found that people recalled 3 times as many of the words when they were given this structure to organize the information. So now I'm going to give you a story, okay? And I want you to, after I'm finished reading this story, I want you to estimate On a scale from 1 to 5, how likely it is that you would be able to recall this story. Okay. So if the balloons popped, the sound wouldn't be able to carry, since everything would be too far away from the correct floor. A closed window would also prevent the sound from carrying, since most buildings tend to be well insulated. Since the whole operation depends on a steady flow of electricity, a break in the middle of the wire would also cause problems. Of course, the fellow could shout, but the human voice is not loud enough to carry that far. An additional problem is that a string could break on the instrument. Then there would be no accompaniment to the message. It is clear that the best situation would involve less distance. Then there would be fewer potential problems. With face-to-face contact, the least number of things could go wrong. Okay, so obviously I don't have you guys face-to-face to tell me one way or the other, but I'm guessing your estimate of your ability to recall this story is pretty low, right? Maybe a 0 or a 1. Because it seems very random and you're not really sure what's going on. What if I showed you this image, or this drawing rather, right? So from this drawing, it becomes readily apparent, okay, that this kind of bizarre story is referencing this gentleman who is singing into a microphone and strumming his guitar, and he's serenading his love interest at the top of the building, right? So in an effort to carry the music all the way up to her floor, the floor of her apartment, he's got a bouquet of balloons and he's tied a speaker to it to carry the song up to where she can hear it, right? Seems like kind of a bizarre thing to do. This experiment was conducted in 1972, so there was no like Spotify or anything like that, right? So it was maybe a little bit more probable that this might happen back then. But nonetheless, when Bransford and Johnson presented this story to participants when they had no picture beforehand, they recalled about 22% of the details. And when they were given the picture afterwards, they didn't do much better, right? So there wasn't a significant difference compared to the no picture condition in terms of their ability to recall. However, they did a lot better. They recalled about 60% of the details when they saw the picture before reading the story. And that's because this drawing helped them to organize and create a coherent narrative of the events that were happening in the story. Okay, I'm going to give you one more example of this. The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange items into different groups. Of course, one pile might be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. It is important not to overdo things. That is, it's better for you to do a few things at once than too many. In the short run, this may not seem important, but complications can easily arise. A mistake can be expensive as well. At first, the whole procedure will seem complicated. Soon, however, it will become just another facet of life. It is difficult to foresee any end to the necessity for this task in the immediate future, but then one can never tell. After the procedure is completed, one arranges the materials into groups again. Then they can be put into their appropriate places. Eventually, they will be used once more, and the whole cycle will have to be repeated. However, that is part of life. So for most people, when they read this story with no context, okay, it's very confusing and they recall very few of the details. But if I show you this picture, suddenly it all makes sense, right? So this is a description of laundry, and it's actually a very accurate and easily understood description as long as you have appropriate context to organize your experiences. Okay? So just to recap, in this lecture, we've talked about how you can optimize your ability to encode information or get it into memory by forming visual images and thus creating two pathways with which you can access information. We've talked about we talked about the benefits of visual imagery. We've talked about deep processing as opposed to shallow processing, right? So thinking about physical or sound-based characteristics doesn't lead to as robust of a memory that's less likely to be forgotten compared to thinking about the meaning of a word or relating a word to yourself, right? Because both deep processing and self-referential processing helps you to associate new information in your working memory with existing information in your long-term memory. And then, of course, having an image or a context to help you organize information is helpful for encoding as well. Okay, so in my next video, I'll talk about how we can optimize not just creating long-term memories or encoding them, but also getting them out of memory. Okay, have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video.